Howdy guys, my name is Josh Helsel. I'm a project coordinator with the Texas A&M Natural Resources Institute. I've been working on the wild pig program for quite a while, and today we're going to be talking about wild pig impacts and abatement. I saw in the title there that there was some call for some research updates as well. I do have some really good new stuff for you guys today. I'm happy to report that, particularly on the economic impact side of things. But in other regards, particularly in the toxicant development front, this COVID stuff has really put the brakes on a lot of things. And last I heard, the toxicants were hopefully going to be labeled for use by this summer. Obviously, that has not happened. I don't have really much new information as far as toxicants, but I do have some good information today, some good updates on economic impacts, and of course, we'll get into the abatement aspect as well. Abatement might be a little bit of a review for some of you folks, but hopefully there'll be some things that you can glean and gather from it as well. Wild pigs, impacts, and abatement. Let's go ahead and hop in there. So first off, this is one of the new things that I have to share today. This came out about May 2020, so just a couple of months ago, and a lot of you folks probably familiar with many of the previous figures that have since changed. But according to the Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Department of Agricultural Economics, we have some updates on crop, livestock, and agricultural property damages in the state of Texas. First off, they came out with losses to grain crops alone are now in excess of $89 million annually in the state of Texas. That's a significant increase. I think a lot of us have known for a number of years now that the numbers should have been higher than the original figures that we had. And so it's good to see those numbers align more closely with what a lot of folks already knew. Another one that I just got yesterday is that losses to Texas livestock estimates now exceed $40 million annually each year in the state of Texas. So that's almost as much as the previous estimate for all damages that we had just until a couple of months ago. And total agricultural damages associated with wild pigs in Texas now have been documented to exceed $100 million annually. Many of you might recall the previous estimates that we were looking at since about 2011, 2012 indicated ag damages at about 52 million. That was a pretty market underestimate, particularly in the last few years, but now we can more accurately reflect and report that greater than $100 million annually figure. So that's definitely good to have. One thing that did not change though is the mitigation expenses. They kept that the same, right? So landowners are still spending approximately $7 million each year on wild pig control and damage mitigation, and that just means the control efforts that people are enacting and the amount of money that it takes to repair many of the damages associated with wild pigs. Something else that's new, relatively new, is the population estimate for the state of Texas. As early as 2011, 2012, the population estimates indicated that we had it came out as a median estimate of 2.6 million wild pigs in the state of Texas in 2012, with population modeling as of 2018 indicating that we could have anywhere between 3 and 5 million wild pigs in the state of Texas. They've since backed off of that a little bit, and now they're saying at least 2 million wild pigs in Texas. And so one thing that I want to point out is that population estimates and modeling for wild pigs are exceedingly difficult. We're talking about a very reclusive, intelligent, and adaptive animal. And so anybody that's going to tell you, oh, we have 2.6435 million wild pigs exactly in the state of Texas, is probably feeding you a line, right? What we can tell you reliably is that we do have millions of wild pigs in Texas. And if we do, in fact, have 2 million wild pigs, that is still more wild pigs here than anywhere else in the United States. So those are some new figures, new economic figures, and even a new population estimate that I know people have been waiting on for a long time. So with that, we'll go ahead and move forward. One thing that I failed to mention, I think, at the beginning of this is that we certainly hope that you guys will tune in tomorrow as well. Impacts and abatement is an extremely broad topic as it relates to wild pigs, and I could talk for a very, very long time about either or both. And so, what we decided to do is break this into a two-part series. And so, whenever it comes time to move on to the next section, we'll cut this talk off, and then we'll pick it up right where we left off tomorrow, in order to capture everything that we wanted to talk about in this talk. But right now, what we're looking at is the Texas distribution. APHIS came out with a new map in 2019, and we're looking all the way back to 1982, so coming on 40 years. And you can see the range expansion and distribution in wild pigs in that time frame. But as of 2019, 99% of Texas had wild pigs. And so that means 253 of Texas's 254 counties. The only exception being far west Texas out there in El Paso County. But an interesting note about that is in 2016, actually, wild pigs were in fact documented in El Paso County. We had a map to reflect that in 2016, but my assumption is the farmers and ranchers out there found the 2 or 3 pigs that got out that way and got lost and took care of them. And ever since 2016, they have not got back into El Paso, or have at least been documented to do so. But they're virtually everywhere, all across Texas. Hundreds of millions of dollars of damage, significant impacts. And I did want to point that out so we know exactly where the pigs are in the state of Texas. Here's that relatively new map again. This is APHIS's USDA APHIS's national map. And you can see wild pigs significantly spread out across the south and east, and also branching out into California, some of the western states. Folks may be surprised to learn they're up there in North Dakota, up there in Michigan, up there in the northeastern states as well. But folks may be really surprised to know that wild pigs are also currently in 5 Canadian provinces. And their ranges are expanding at a fairly rapid clip. I had some numbers for exactly how fast the ranges are expanding, but I don't know if they're exactly accurate, but we do know that they are expanding fairly rapidly. And what this points to is the fact that wild pigs are not just an issue in Texas. They're not just an issue in the southeastern United States. Heck, they're not just an issue in North America. Australia and New Zealand has some of the worst wild pig problems in the world. In addition to that, South America, big problems in Argentina and Brazil, particularly with ag production. Also in Europe, and of course Russia, where these animals originated. And so the whole point being is that this is a worldwide issue, right? It's not just a Texas deal, even though here in Texas we're said to have more than anybody else in the United States. Moving into specific impacts, I want to point out that there's numerous impacts associated with wild pigs, be it water quality or native species habitat, and disease transmissions, and a variety of others. I wanted to focus primarily on control today, so I picked a few impacts. I think many of us are aware of the extent of the impacts, but we'll start with the wildlife impacts. And so the first one being wild pigs will in fact actively kill and eat wildlife. Now this includes ground nesting birds, like quail, like your bobwhite quail, other quail species, also eastern and Rio Grande turkeys, and particularly the eggs of both. Ungulate fawns such as white-tailed deer. But I want to point out too that there's a little misconception out there about the predation capabilities of wild pigs. A lot of people view them as true predators in the sense of a mountain lion or a coyote or a bobcat or something like that. But wild pigs are actually classified as opportunistic omnivores. Research going back decades and decades now has documented that the vast majority of their diet, the lowest end of the spectrum is 85% that I've come across, and the highest end is 95. So between 85 and 95% of a wild pig's diet is actually vegetation, right? Roots, tubers, forbs. Generally, they are looking to exploit vegetation first. However, they will opportunistically consume the animals that we've discussed. Also, explosive breeders like your spadefoot toad, reptiles and amphibians, and a variety of others. Many farmers and ranchers and producers are familiar with the impacts that they can have on sheep and goat populations as well. But it's important to point out that this is typically done in an opportunistic fashion. They'll exploit those resources when they're available, particularly in times of low resource availability. But the general preference, the majority preference for these animals is in fact vegetation. And that's why resource availability plays such a crucial role when it comes to lethal and even non-lethal control of wild pigs. But they do in fact have that impact. And of course, they destroy habitat and compete with native species for resources. Now, I probably need to change this slide because I've been doing this a long time now, and in my experience, it's really not much of a competition at all. It's generally an out competition, and I think a lot of you with experience with pigs would agree. And what we're going to look at here now is just an example of how that out competition can occur. Now that I'm listening to this in headphones, I don't know if you guys could hear the guy say, "Look at all those bucks running off." That's why I hate them. Um, and a lot of folks don't like pigs for a lot of reasons, and this is one of them, right? But this is an example of out competition because what we just watched here is a 30-pound sow chase off 5 or 6 mature bucks from a supplemental feed site. Now, folks are very familiar that wild pigs will dominate supplemental feed sites, and that's not why I show this video. I show this video because after what you just saw, I want you to think about something. Wild pigs cannot sweat, right? So they don't have sweat glands, and what that creates is a biological requirement for them to occupy surface water systems, for them to remain in riparian areas the majority of the time. In addition to their E. coli deposits in surface water systems, they also have impacts on native species. And with the level of out competition that you just saw with that 30-pound sow, I want you to think about in the hot summer months when wild pigs are present on your property. Who do you think gets the best access to those valuable water sources, particularly in the heat? Do you think it's going to be your wild pig sounders and your big old wild pigs, or do you think it's going to be your deer and your turkeys that are probably trying to get away from those guys as soon as possible, right? And the answer to that is generally it's going to be the pigs that are going to outcompete for that resource. At the same time, in the wintertime, right, when we have our Texas 2 and 3 day winters and it gets really cold below freezing and stuff, who do you think is going to get the best access to that core bedding habitat, to that core thick cover that animals will seek out in order to protect themselves from the cold? Is it going to be pigs, or is it going to be your bucks that are going to run away from a 30-pound sow? And usually the answer is it's going to be wild pigs. And so as producers, as landowners, as wildlife managers, we need to have a very low tolerance for wild pigs on the landscape. The simple reason being is that when wild pigs are there, the access to resources that you want for your native species is going to be diminished. And that's a main impact that we need to be aware of, and willing to counter with our lethal and non-lethal control strategies. Moving forward to other impacts, we're going to talk about disease transmissions. There's numerous diseases that we could talk about, but I just picked this one as an example. As a matter of fact, wild pigs are known to carry at least 45 separate diseases. Now, 24 of these diseases are known to be directly transmissible to humans. An interesting point about this is that the vast majority of these diseases actually, or the disease transmissions rather, actually occur through direct or indirect contact and not through consumption. According to the CDC, provided that wild pig meat is prepared to 165 degrees internal temperature, there are no known diseases that can be transmitted through the consumption of wild pigs. And so, what that means is eating the pigs is not your big problem. The big problem is using areas where pigs are present, is processing pigs, is handling pigs. And the same extends true to tick-borne illness. And so this particular study here that came out in 2011 found that 3 out of every 4 wild pigs in Texas are potentially infested. So 75% of the pigs that we have in Texas are carrying these ticks, and specifically exoded or hard-shelled ticks. And all you really need to know about that is that these are the ones that have the bad stuff, that have things like rickettsial infections, borrelial infections, Lyme disease, ehrlichiosis, and others, right? So the ticks that are on pigs in Texas are the bad ones, right? And this other study here in 2014 from Ferreira Arroyo, this was in South Texas, but of their sampling, Lyme disease and related co-infections were detected in almost half, right? So almost 1 out of every 2 ticks that they pulled off of a pig wasn't just a bad tick that is capable of it, but these ticks were actually harboring infections like borreliosis, Lyme disease, rickettsial infections, and others. And that's why it's very, very important to be aware when you are handling pigs, when you are processing pigs, even when you're using outdoor areas where pigs are present, for the simple fact that direct or indirect disease transmissions occur. And that also extends out to brucellosis, pseudorabies, and others, even among livestock and other wildlife species. So the potential for disease transmission, whether it's ticks or any of the other diseases associated with wild pigs, is significant. And it's something that we need to be aware of when we're out in the field, when we're controlling pigs, even when we're doing something completely different in areas where pigs are present, because it certainly is a significant impact associated with this species. Okay, um, like I said, I could go more and more on impacts, but what I want to do now is transition a little bit more into control and some considerations that we need to have when we enact control. And one of the things that we need to be aware of is the intelligence of wild pigs, right? These are some of the most highly intelligent and adaptable animals on the planet. And part of the reason for their success is, one, obviously their reproductive capacity. You know, they're classified as the most reproductively successful large mammal worldwide. At 6 months old, a sow is able to conceive a litter of 4 to 6 piglets, right? And not only that, the older that she gets, the more offspring she can potentially produce. I've heard of as many as 12 in the wild per litter in an older sow and 14 in captivity. So that is some significant reproductive capacity every 3 months, 3 weeks, and 3 days throughout their entire reproductive lifespan. But then you add to that the intelligence of these animals, and you have a very formidable situation. And it's not surprising why we have the level of issues and problems that we have. But I said that they're highly intelligent and adaptable, also easily educated to avoid traps. They will very quickly go nocturnal on you. They can be difficult to pattern, and in some cases, they will even pattern you. I've had that happen to me, and it certainly didn't help my control efforts. But one of the most important things that we need to be aware of when we're enacting both lethal or non-lethal control is their intelligence, and we do need to account for that intelligence. If we don't account for that intelligence, you'll probably still experience some success. There's no doubt about that. But what happens more often than not is that success will wane. It will diminish. And before you know it, you can't figure out why you can't get a single pig into your trap, or why they don't come into your shooting sites, or why they just seem to be gone every time you're there, right? And a lot of that has to do with the intelligence. But the Achilles heel of a pig, one of them, right, that can be viewed as, it is their intelligence, right? Because that intelligence causes the wild pigs to respond very quickly to pressure. And pressure is a very powerful tool in wild pig management. Now, there's two ways to look at this, right? For one, we have population reduction, and we want to implement control tools and strategies that will enact population reduction. But sometimes population reduction is not feasible. Maybe you're in an urban area. Maybe you have a small tract land where wild pigs are coming off a larger tract land that you don't have access to. There's many, many situations where population reduction is not necessarily feasible. And in those cases, what we can do is capitalize on the wild pig response to pressure in order to achieve our management goals. We can actually direct animal movements to ultimately reduce damages and force wild pigs to abandon areas where they're causing damage. And so what I would suggest to you guys today is to think about our control strategies in a couple of ways. Think about them as tools of pressure versus tools of population reduction, and think about them as lethal strategies versus non-lethal strategies. And what we're going to do today is we're going to get into that. I'm going to explain it, and hopefully you can glean a little insight as to which tool you can use for what end, and hopefully pick up something that you can apply to your situation as well. Move forward here. There we go. Okay. So I said that wild pigs are intelligent and we have to account for it, and I spent a lot of time talking about how important that is, but I really want to drive this home by comparing the top 6 most intelligent animals. What we have here is parrots, primates, killer whales, pigs, bottlenose dolphins, and dogs, right? These are very intelligent species in their own right. Um, but I would like you to think in your head, who would be the smartest one on this list? Who would be number 2? Who would be number 3, 4, and so on? We'll jump right into it, right? Primates are number 1, right? These animals are the most closely related to human beings. They have opposable thumbs. They can utilize tools. By all accounts, primates are very, very intelligent. But pigs are number 2, right? And pigs are number 2 in front of some pretty heavy hitters here that you're looking at. In some cases, neuroscientists are actually studying the neural synapses of pig brains as opposed to primate brains, because they're said to be more closely related to human function. That's significant. Let that sink in, especially when you consider that pigs are more intelligent than bottlenose dolphins. I mean, you guys have seen Flipper, right? You saw what that guy did. But in all seriousness, bottlenose dolphins are species that the United States Navy has trained to place bombs on enemy submarines. And pigs are more intelligent than that. Pigs are more intelligent than parrots that can live 100 years or more, learn multiple languages by association, and by all accounts are highly intelligent. Pigs are more intelligent than killer whales, some of the most intelligent pack hunters on the planet. These animals can actually immobilize and kill great white sharks by grabbing them behind the dorsal fin, turning them upside down so that they can't get water through their gills, and then consume them that way. That is some very intelligent behavior, and they're number 5 on the list. Also dogs, right? Fido can get your dove for you. He can go get your duck or your paper. But he's really got nothing on a pig. And in some ways, this can translate to the use of trained dogs as a control strategy. We will address that either today or tomorrow. But we'll talk about trained dogs, how research shows that they're best utilized, because they are a viable tool in wild pig management. However, I think that a lot of folks may implement them the wrong way. Not necessarily the wrong way, but in ways that don't align with years and years of successful eradication studies and research worldwide. But that just goes to show, right? Pigs are up there. They're very smart, and we have to account for that intelligence. Here's a little bit of that in action here. These pigs know exactly where those groceries come from. You don't see deer doing that too much. He's about to rip out that gut box there. And you can tell by the big dent here that this is not the first time that that's happened. We know what's going to happen next. That feeder is going to topple over. The pigs are going to eat all of that supplemental feed. You're going to have to fix that and replace that feeder and spend all that money. And the worst part about it is the native species that you had intended to access that bait to get them through the winter, or in this case, the summer, can no longer do that. And so that's just an example of intelligent behavior by a wild pig. But I do want to talk about supplemental feed sites, and I want to talk about some research about supplemental feed sites as well. They say that we have more wild pigs here in Texas than anywhere else in the United States. And I do believe that to be true. But one thing that I'm fairly certain of is that we have more supplemental feed sites and deer feeders and box blinds in the state of Texas than anywhere else in the United States, probably combined. And I don't have research on this. This is more of a common sense opinion, right? But I tend to believe that all of that supplemental feed, that free range supplemental feed spinning year round all across the state of Texas, is potentially one of the reasons why we might have more pigs here than anywhere else. I would think a lot of people would agree with me on that. But there's some things that we can do, right? And so we talked a little bit, brought up about lethal control strategies versus non-lethal control strategies. And there's some very interesting ways that we can make our non-lethal control strategies supplement our lethal control strategies. For example, research conducted at Texas A&M found that 28 to 34 inch paneling will exclude wild pigs completely, while still allowing access by your native species, such as your deer, such as your turkeys, and others. Now, I like to say this: pigs are smart enough to be lazy, and they're lazy enough to be smart, right? And so think about this on your property. Say you have 6, 7, 8 deer feeders on your property, and you decide to exclude those feeders through something similar to what you're seeing right here. Now, what do you think is going to happen, particularly in times of low resource availability, when wild pigs can no longer access supplemental feed sites readily on your property? And the answer is, some of them will remain on the property, but a large portion of them are actually going to move away, and they're going to abandon areas in search of an easier meal. And what that means is that they're going to go over to your neighbor's property. And make no mistake, the whole point of this talk is to figure out how we can get the pigs on our property over to our neighbor's property. Now, of course, I'm kidding, right? We do not want to drive the wild pigs over to our neighbor's property. But consider this: what if we got with our neighbors and got with the neighbor on the other side and maybe a couple neighbors around that, and we all excluded our supplemental feed sites? Pretty soon, we're going to have a very large area where wild pigs cannot get an easy meal. And what that's going to do is a fair portion of them are going to abandon that area. And the ones that are left, I want you to consider, would they be more likely or less likely, particularly in times of low resource availability, to visit our traps now, to visit our corral traps and our box traps, or go to our supplemental feed sites, our supplemental feed sites for strategic shooting purposes? And the answer is, you'll have a much greater chance of trapping success and also strategic shooting success by essentially driving pigs to where you want them to be, at the same time having already caused a large number of those pigs to abandon that area right off of the bat. And so this is just a good example of a non-lethal control strategy that can be highly successful in reducing numbers on your property, but also supplementing and increasing the success of your lethal control strategies. Something else that we can do with non-lethal strategies like exclusion fencing is use them, implement them to reduce damages. Because remember, a lot of times we can't reduce populations, and in those cases, we do want to reduce damages. Electrified exclusions is a quite cost-effective way to achieve this. This is a study that we're looking at here from 2007, but it's still entirely relevant because it works as good today as it did back then. And what this particular study found that was the two-strand electric fence compared to no fence at all resulted in approximately 2/3 less damage to ag crops, right? And so if we assume that every pig causes the same amount of damage, I mean, obviously they don't, but if we assume that for the purposes of this example, you could potentially keep 2 out of every 3 pigs out of your fields and from causing damage in your fields just by implementing a non-lethal control strategy such as electrified exclusion. And so here's another option of how we can use non-lethal control in this case to significantly reduce damages and to do so with electrified exclusion at a fairly affordable rate, right? And so this could apply to, it applies mostly to ag crops, but I've seen some creative things done in suburban areas and a variety of other areas as well. But this is primarily for protecting ag crops. But again, wild pig management and wild pig control is a tweak and refine process, right? You need to be prepared to observe what's going on in your situation and to modify that situation as necessary.